You called out the problem of the post-World War II consensus, what we got wrong.
I think the proper perspective is to think about the First and Second World Wars and the Holocaust as one traumatic event. Western civilization is one thing before the two world wars and the Holocaust, and it's something quite different after. It's after the Second World War that the U.S. Supreme Court, with some help from Congress, begins to systematically eliminate any kind of... That created an opening for something new.
But with religious tolerance, that existed before the war, did it not?
Tolerance is not the same thing as neutrality. The real revolution was not of the generation of the 60s. It was their... It's fine to say that this is all about liberalism. Religion and nationality were seen as the villains that had to go.
I'm very surprised to hear this. We allied with a devil to defeat another devil.
Why is it that today the hammer and sickle is not like the swastika?
We don't have the same opinions in the West.
I think that you simply have to face the fact that when you teach this lie generation after generation, you destroy absolutely everything.
Can the West be turned around? Before you hear from Yoram Hazony, I ask if you want to support this show, all you have to do is press subscribe. 68% of our regular viewers are not yet subscribed. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Yoram exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media won't touch. And if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, not only will you get ad-free viewing and listening, but you'll get an extended conversation between me and Yoram, and you'll be able to ask future guests your questions. But without further ado, Yoram Hazony. Well, Yoram, thank you so much for coming to speak with me. I, as you know, have been following your work very closely for many years. Your article back in September 2016, Nationalism, the Future of Western Freedom, was incredibly influential on my political thinking. But most notable, of course, we're here you're now back in London because it's the second edition of your book, The Virtue of Nationalism, that came out of this article. And not just two editions of a book have come out of this article, but the whole national conservative movement that you founded seemed to have come back from this article. And it's so influential that members of the White House, not least the Vice President, are regular attendees of NatCon, as far as I'm aware. And your influence has reached across the globe. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with me. The thing I was particularly rereading it in preparation for this conversation, the thing I wanted to get into with you is that you called out, as far back as then, the problem of the post-World War II consensus. And we've had Rusty Reno on the show, Jonathan Pajot on the show discussing this. And I think a lot of what we're seeing, the populist movement across the world, or call it national populism, is a response, in my belief, to the post-World War II consensus, what we got wrong about the post-World War II consensus, which I'm hoping to explore with you today. And I think in exploring it, we'll pick apart your ideas about nationalism, about liberal globalism, and all of that. But I might start, if you don't mind, by just reading something that, this is why I think you're ahead of the curve. This is back in 2016. You wrote, "For 350 years, Western peoples have lived in a world in which national independence and self-determination were seen as foundational principles. Indeed, these things were held to be among the most precious human possessions and the basis for all of our freedoms. But since World War II, these intuitions have been gradually attenuated and finally even discredited, especially among academics and intellectuals, media opinion makers, and business and political elites." So, what is your analysis about what happened after World War II that sent the nationalist project array?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's always good to be in London. It's always good to be with you. So my pleasure.
Pleasure's mine.
I think the proper perspective is to think about the First and Second World Wars and the Holocaust as one long traumatic event. Western civilization is one thing before the two world wars and the Holocaust, and it's something quite different after the end of the Second World War. and Rusty and many others have written compellingly on the subject. I think the simplest way to think about it is as a very great trauma. The combatants, certainly the combatants from the United States and Western Europe and the Allied countries, came out of this cataclysm with an intense desire to make sure it never happens again. Now, that created an opening, and an opening for something new. And the something new that was adopted is what I think is appropriate to call Enlightenment liberalism, meaning that the United States and other countries, certainly Britain and other countries that were allied with the United States, went into this period, the first half of the 20th century, seeing themselves as Christian nations, as peoples that had an ancient heritage. I mean, this is certainly much more true of Britain than the United States, but it was also true of the United States that if you take a look, for example, at Franklin Roosevelt's speeches, his State of the Union address right before World War II in 1939, you see that he and Eisenhower and that entire generation represented a view that saw democracy, the freedom of Western nations, both the internal democratic form of government, representative government, and also the idea of independent nations. Both of those aspects appear before the war as an outgrowth of Christianity. That is, in those days, it wasn't surprising to have Western leaders, and Churchill certainly among them, arguing that what were we fighting for? We're definitely fighting for national freedom and for free societies, but that was seen as coming out as an outgrowth of the Christian inheritance, of the biblical inheritance. So the framing was, and the word crusade was used freely to describe the war. It was a crusade. It was Christian civilization against an atheist barbarism. Now, we don't hear that framing for World War II anymore. I mean, I grew up. I never heard it. I only found it in researching my book on conservatism, which is the next book after that one. But there is a sharp departure after the Second World War, an intense desire to make sure it never happens again. Mm-hmm. And the solution that that liberals of all kinds came up with was, we're going to suppress religious particularism and traditionalism. We're going to suppress national independence and particularism. And we're going to go for something that I think is properly described as kind of a thoroughgoing, like a pure liberalism, a liberalism in which not only do you say that in general people should be treated equally and should be their individual liberties should be respected, but what was created was a very, very sharp, clear view that anything that violates the individual rights, the freedoms and equality of peoples, simply has to be uprooted. Now, obviously, there are things that are good about this new liberalism that I'm describing. I mean, in the United States, especially those returning from the war who had fought against racialist regimes both in Europe and in the Pacific theater, they came home and they couldn't live with the continuation of abuse and persecution of blacks in the American South. And so a very large part of the impetus to adopt this kind of new perfect liberalism, this perfect equality and perfect liberty for everyone, was embarrassment and shame over things that, that I myself, had I been there, I assume that I would have been supportive. Certainly today, looking back on it, I see it as something positive. But the decision to jettison the more particularistic view of the United States and Britain and other European countries as Christian nations, as nations with a particular religious, national, and constitutional heritage. The result of that was the creation of this theory that a state can be neutral, that a state can be neutral among all people. That the state should not have preferences, whether someone is a Christian or a Jew or an atheist or a Muslim or a Hindu. It should make no difference whatsoever to anyone. And by the time that you get to the 1960s, you have a dramatic overhaul of reconstruction of society in order to try to make sure that that blacks are treated just exactly the way whites are, that men are treated just like women are, that foreigners are treated just like locals are, and eventually it gets to some very, very wild things.
Here's a quick word from today's sponsor, Ground News. Let's take a quick look at how the media is reporting on Trump's new tariffs using Ground News. Left-leaning Democracy Now! Ran the headline, "Total random chaos of Trump's tariffs are not rebalancing US trade." We specifically partnered with Ground News because their app and website helped me and my team cut through media bias and get the full picture on any story like this one. There are over 160 articles published on Trump's new tariffs, and we can access every single one through Ground News, complete with source context and key breakdowns. Meanwhile, right-leaning India Today led with, "Trump hits dozens of countries with tariffs, increases Canada's levies to 35%. Two very different narratives from the left and the right on the same story. Seeing all sides, regardless of political lean, is essential to making informed decisions and spotting bias. That's why Ground News' blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by either side, is such a powerful tool. I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing, and I encourage you to check it out by scanning the QR code or visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded, so by supporting my sponsors, you are also supporting this show. Just one detail there. So just on the idea of the state being neutral to religious groups, is it not the case that the state was neutral before the Great War on when it comes to religion, with religious freedom, for example? Obviously, you can point to how women didn't have the vote, and it was not neutral when it came to foreigners. There was more of a concept of borders and sovereignty, but with religious tolerance, that existed before the war, did it not?
Tolerance is not the same thing as neutrality.
What's the difference?
Well, I should mention I just published a couple of weeks ago an essay with two co-authors, with Timon Klein and Josh Hammer, in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, and the subject of the essay is the invention of separation of church and state in the United States in the year 1947 by the Supreme Court. So it's a long essay, but it goes into detail on the question of the established churches in the United States at the time of the writing of the Constitution and the First Amendment. With the exception of Virginia, all of the other 13 American states joined the Union with different kinds of religious establishments. So there were a number of states that had particular denominations that were established, like the Congregationalists in Massachusetts, but almost all of them had Protestantism as an established religion. And that meant all sorts of things that varied from state to state, but that included religious tests for holding office, Sabbath laws, blasphemy laws, the current conception of a state that is not involved in the support of religion is, once again, it enters American constitutional law only after the Second World War.
Okay.
So if I were looking at it from the perspective of a British perspective, where the Constitution obviously has a special place for the Church of England here in England, and the Church of Scotland in Scotland, and so on. From a British perspective, I would say that the American Constitution looks like it's a version of the English Constitution, the British Constitution, all the way up until the Second World War. When it's after the Second World War that the U.S. Supreme Court, with some help from Congress, begins to systematically eliminate any kind of support for Christianity or for biblical religion.
Okay.
It's something new, and as a consequence, the question of whether the new world in which we live, in which birth rates are falling and people find it extremely difficult to stay married, and the old Christianity and other religions like Judaism have sort of been pushed out of the public sphere, and then there's these new religions like this woke neo-Marxism, which are battling to try to seize control of the state. In Britain, we also have the question of the public presence of Islam for the first time in history. All of these questions, to my mind, begin with the decision after the Second World War to attempt to uproot the American state's support for Christianity and other faiths.
Okay, so what about the Second World War then made them go down that path? Why did they think to change so much, particularly in America? In a sense, I can understand why Europe, which really felt the brunt of the trauma, might try and have an analysis and reshape things. But America won the war. Obviously, a lot of Americans were killed, but it might have come back with confidence about what it was. America was the nation, the liberal democratic nation that led this crusade and won. Why then was this shift of thinking over there?
I'm not sure I can give you a full answer. I think you've put your finger historically on the decisive question. Why is it that a country that went into the war consciously committed to fighting for a modern form of Christendom, of America as the God-fearing nation? That's a phrase again from Franklin Roosevelt, that America was leading an alliance of God-fearing nations against nations that had no, that did not fear God, the Nazis and their allies. And I agree with you. The sensible thing, if history simply made sense, then it would have been a great victory for this kind of Christian republicanism or Christian democracy. My sense of it, I don't want to insist that this is the only view, because I'm really not sure. But my sense of it is that throughout the 20th century, there had already been a tremendous amount of argumentation and education and theorizing in the direction of claiming that what was wrong with the world is that particularisms, particular faith traditions, and particular national traditions were standing in the way of a kind of a springtime for humanity, a cosmopolitan Kantian kind of vision, where all the nations would make a pact and cease to have warfare, and in all of this theorizing about the end of history, they relied on the Enlightenment prejudice that religion and nationality were the cause of mankind's suffering. So it's an argument that was not new after the Second World War. It's an argument that is already has versions of it circulating a couple of hundred years earlier. And I think that what actually happened is that the view of a devastated world. Okay, you're right that the United States was not devastated, but half 500,000 combat deaths was hard enough for the Americans, and they looked at a devastated world, which included almost all of Europe, Russia, Africa, the Middle East, and much of the East. They looked at this, and they had apparently been prepared by their fathers and their grandfathers to think that what was the cause of these kinds of things. The cause was that people had allowed their religious passions and their national commitments, their national identities, to obliterate reason. Okay, this is not a view I'm terribly sympathetic to, but I think that if we try to understand them, the generation that came back from the Second World War. By the way, people obviously many people think that the 1960s were a moment of kind of cultural revolution throughout the West, and there is some truth to that. But the real revolution was not of the generation of the 60s. It was their parents.
In the 40s. In
the 40s, their parents came home and decided we're going to rebuild the world so that everyone is perfectly equal and everyone is perfectly free, and religion and nationality were seen as the villains that had to go. Yeah.
So Reno puts his finger on Karl Popper for this particular fallacy, which I happen to agree with. And so if you read The Open Society and Its Enemies, published in 1944, Karl Popper being an Austrian Jew, I think he fled to New Zealand. This was his war effort. And he creates this dichotomy, which on the good side, as I've already pointed out, you have liberalism, you have democracy, you have freedom, free speech, and the bad side, the opposite that we must eliminate, not only was fascism and Nazism, which I'm sure we all agree on, but also nationalism, religion, both of which he saw as sort of mystic nonsense. And so that seems to me, as far as I can find any major philosophical moment where that dichotomy is made, is 1944 with Popper. And then after him, you have, following in his stead, loads of philosophers kind of taking that, in pursuit of never again, taking that sort of that dichotomy as for granted almost.
Yes, I certainly agree with Rusty that Popper is an important figure. I think that there are many other such figures
at the same time.
At the same time, I mean, Friedrich Hayek is an obvious example. Hayek was already writing about the importance of eliminating borders completely. He was already writing that certainly by 1940. And his book, The Road to Serfdom, very, very famous polemical work against both Nazism and communism. The Road to Serfdom, people don't remember that it ends with a chapter about the importance of a world government that will eliminate all of the borders. Add to this, I mean, Ayn Rand in the 1940s and 1950s was probably the most important popularizer of the view of a world in which there are no visible boundaries whatsoever. There's no religion. Anyone who believes in religion is some kind of a crazy person in her novels. So there is no religion, and there's no borders. Borders are an arbitrary, from this view, arbitrary constriction of individual liberty and trade. So all of these are in the 1940s, but let's not forget that between the wars, there was already the Kellogg-Briand Treaty, the League of Nations banned war, meaning the utopian view that we could simply all decide that there was nothing to fight about anymore was sufficiently powerful that in the hands of Woodrow Wilson and others of his generation, that they already declared it to be international law, that that there would be no more fighting again. So I agree that Popper is very important as an example, but we're talking about a much broader generational effort. And let me also add that all of the names that we're naming, Popper, Hayek, Rand, and many others that we can name, Woodrow Wilson as well, all of them fit rather easily within a tradition, a liberal tradition, a tradition that sees the rights of the individual as paramount. And it's fine to say that this is all about liberalism, but that's only part of the story, because the Marxists, and I mean, both the neo-Marxist intellectuals after World War I, but also the Stalinists, the followers of Stalin throughout the West, they also were hostile in an extremely aggressive way, both to the idea of national borders and to the idea of religion. So that I think a fuller picture is that you get to the end of World War II, and Hitler, who I don't consider him to be a nationalist, because a nationalist is someone who believes in a world of independent nations.
Yes, you argue that he was an imperialist.
Yeah, so he is what Anthony Smith once called a biological imperialist. His theory is that the strongest biological race should triumph. He had complete contempt for the idea of independent nations and national independence, and believed that Germany should be, as he wrote in Mein Kampf, masters of the globe and mistress of the earth. Now, Hitler destroyed the older admiration for the word nationalism. He adopted it. You can say that he appropriated the word nationalism for the benefit of his biological imperialism. And after the war, it became rhetorically very, very easy for liberals and Marxists both to focus on nationalism and religion as the two twin sins that had brought all the violence and all the destruction. I think if you try to make the argument that they were right, I think it gets more difficult, since it's very difficult to say that that the Nazis or that the Japanese during the Second World War, both imperialists. The Italian fascists were also imperialists. Stalin was also an imperialist. So the argument that the war was caused by nationalism and religion, it seems to me implausible. But historically, I think that's what happened. Is that liberals and Marxists together decided after the war that these were the causes of the two world wars and the Holocaust, and they had to be eliminated.
When you say that he used the word nationalism, do you mean that in the term National Socialism, that's where he takes the word nationalism? Did he use it more?
No, I mean that if you read Mein Kampf, and please do not take this as a book recommendation. I know people say Yoram was on his show and he was like talking about how you had to read Mein Kampf. No. Don't read Mein Kampf. Not fun, not worth reading. But if you were to pick it up, what you would find is that although Hitler hates the Western idea of national independence, although he hates it, he does appropriate the explicit term nationalism. He does not use imperialism in the book at all. He doesn't describe himself as an imperialist, even though his goal is to be master of the earth. He describes himself as a nationalist because the word nationalism actually had a very positive, kind of progressive sounding ring to it in those days.
Okay. So one of the arguments that Jonathan Pajot made on this show is that another mistake that was made then, and I think this has been somewhat implicit in what you're saying, is that the West also, by allying with the communists and the Soviets to defeat Nazism, we didn't, or he would say that we allied with a devil to defeat another devil. And in so doing, we don't have the same opinions in the West about communism on average than we do about nationalism, or I should say Nazism. So even though more people were killed under the hammer and sickle than under the swastika, it is perfectly socially acceptable to wear a hammer and sickle, although obviously if you wore a swastika rightly, you'd get in all sorts of trouble. Yes. But in this country, you even had politicians, I immediately think of Diane Abbott for Labour, saying Mao did more good than harm. If anyone, conservative, dared say that Hitler did more good than harm, then of course that would be the end of their career. But it's not so the case the other way around. And so do you think that Jonathan's onto something with that?
Yes.
That line of thinking?
Yes. Here I do have a book recommendation for you. There's a new book, in the last 3 or 4 years, called Stalin's War by the historian Sean McMeekin. It's published by Basic. And it's you can say that it's revisionist. I don't mean that it's revisionist in the sense of saying good things about Hitler, but the book looks at World War II from the perspective of Stalin's aims and Stalin's crimes, and it argues, I think, amazingly persuasively, that the real winner in the war was the Soviet Union, which emerged having conquered half of Europe and half of Asia, and was treated throughout the war, especially by Roosevelt and his administration, less so by Churchill, but was certainly treated throughout the war by Roosevelt as though the Soviet Union were much more than an alliance with the devil, right? That was probably Churchill's view, I imagine.
Definitely Churchill's view.
That was not Roosevelt's view. And the book is devastating both in the detailed description of the penetration of Roosevelt's close circle and his administration by communist agents, by Soviet agents. And it's also devastating in describing Roosevelt's mistakes, which brought that about. Now, I mean, it's true that the Soviets were good at espionage and penetrating, foreign circles, but Roosevelt systematically pushed away advisors who did not see the Soviet Union as I want to be careful. I want to say an ideological ally. Okay, he wasn't.
I'm very surprised to hear this.
Roosevelt was not. I'm not saying that he himself wanted to turn the United States into the Soviet Union, but there is at this point a tremendous amount of evidence that if you want to know why is it that Britain was given such unfavorable terms compared to the Soviet Union in terms of support during the war. Roosevelt was famously hesitant about gifting Britain with the things that the British needed in order to fight the war. He was not hesitant at all when it came to the Soviet Union. The book really comes close to saying that Roosevelt betrayed Britain, and it does say that Roosevelt betrayed Chiang Kai-shek, that the Chinese nationalists were betrayed, and so the story is a gullible Roosevelt who failed to see both the great evil that the Soviet Union intended to impose on conquered nations, but also failed to see the degree to which he was manipulated by Stalin and the Soviets, with the result that not only Yalta, which is famous, Churchill wanted the Allies to proceed from Italy north into Poland to try to save Eastern Europe. And Roosevelt refused and accepted Stalin's alternative plan of invading through Normandy. But when you look at Asia and the vast advantages that the Soviets received by the fact that the Americans stopped supporting Chiang and therefore freed up the communists, freed up Stalin's Chinese allies to take over. It is, I have to tell you, it's devastating reading.
Would you mind elaborating on? So, was he gullible, or was he sympathetic to what exactly happened? I mean,
I think that he was sympathetic in the sense that he felt that that communism was based on the same fundamental values as his own liberalism. And that does not mean that he was an actual communist sympathizer. I want to be careful. I'm definitely not saying that. But he considered Nazism to be extremely far. It was clear to him that Nazism was evil. It was not clear to him that Soviet communism was evil. I think he would have said that it was mistaken on various points. But the post-war, this post-war liberalism that we're describing, it had a very great time coming around to seeing Soviet communism as an enemy.
It had a difficult time.
A difficult time,
yeah, right?
Meaning that
go on.
Meaning that the idea that the Soviet Union was a threat to the United States, which Churchill saw clearly and other leaders saw clearly, but I think it was very difficult for many of the Americans to take it seriously up until Sputnik.
The thing that immediately comes to mind is that President Truman, Roosevelt's successor, was very clear about the threat of communism.
Yes.
And they were. I mean, this was the period of McCarthyism just afterwards, and they're trying to get all the communist spies out, suss them out, and they're sort of clear that they recognized, and not this is the beginning of the Cold War. So then the Soviets become the enemy of America. So maybe what you're saying sort of applies to FDR.
I think you're absolutely right that Truman was not naive in the way that FDR was.
Uh-huh.
I think that's absolutely true, and you're right that we get from Truman, we get the confrontation over Greece and the Balkans, and the Berlin airlift, and then Korea. All of this is for sure. I agree with you. I think that if you're going to raise the question of why is it that today communism is not, the hammer and sickle is not like the swastika, I think that you simply have to face the fact that that until very late in the game, until the doctors' trials and of Stalin, and then later Khrushchev's Khrushchev's revelations of Stalin's crimes, there continued to be a whitewashing, which I think came from a relatively forgiving view of the threat of communism. The fact is that McCarthy was right in many of the things that he said. I mean, he was correctly describing, I don't know if he got all the details correct, but he was correctly describing a massive penetration of the United States by Soviet agents. And the fact is that he was considered by most to be a problem and a lunatic. Maybe we could have had a better personality, who could have sold it better. But look, even in the 1980s, when I was in college and Reagan was president, Thatcher was prime minister, even then, the view of the Soviet Union as a hostile adversary was largely rejected by the professorate. As conservative students, one of the things that made us oddballs and outcasts, outcasts is a little bit extreme, but the thing that made us distasteful to the majority of students on campus was the willingness to see communism as an actual threat. The great majority of students considered communism, the same kind of things that people say today about Iran or the Muslim Brotherhood. They love their children just like we do. That was the most common thing. Was they called him Ronald Reagan? Why? He was a warmonger. He was going to start World War III because he foolishly called the Soviets the evil empire. Well, most of the well-intentioned liberal people, students and professors, all thought that Reagan was an extremist, and that his claims of the evil of the Soviet Union were preposterous.
Yeah. So
I think there's a very large story to be told about why anti-communists like William Buckley and National Review, but also James Burnham and the whole crew who created the new conservatism in the 1960s. Why was it so difficult for them to sell anti-communism? It was difficult because they were a small minority, and confronting communism as though it were Nazism was simply not on anybody's agenda.
So can you tie this back together with the growth of liberal globalism? So I think listeners of this show will sort of be quite aware of how Marxism and this socialist worldview penetrated the academy, and we've explored that, and we can see how it's kind of infiltrated all areas of public life and the institutions. But liberal globalism itself grew. You describe it as the sort of liberal construction of the West in the virtue of nationalism. Can you take me on that journey a little bit? I guess. This development before the earthquakes of 2016?
Sure. Again, when I'm talking about liberalism, I'm not talking about just the parties of the left. Post-war liberalism it's an appropriate description of both the center left and the center right in America, in Britain, and throughout Europe. When I speak of liberalism, I'm using the term sort of in the in the academic sense. A liberal is someone who thinks that individual liberty, right? That human beings are born perfectly free and perfectly equal, if we'll quote John Locke. That moral and political obligations are undertaken as a consequence of consent. Right? You have to agree that you have an obligation somehow in order for you to have an obligation. Finally, the concept of the purpose of government as being exclusively the defending of individual rights and equality. Those three things together, that's what I'm calling liberalism.
Okay.
And you'll notice that it describes post-war political parties, certainly by the 1960s. It describes post-war political parties, Democrats and Republicans, Labor and Tories, and in Europe, Christian Democrats and Social Democrats. So we come out of the Second World War, certainly by the time we get to the 1960s, with we can call it hegemonic, a certain view, a fundamental view of what is it important to understand about politics. What are we trying to achieve with politics? And there are arguments between Democrats and Republicans about how do we balance individual liberties with individual equality, and that goes on for generations. But the agreement that what's crucial, what's essential in politics is liberty, equality, and the consent, and that government has only one legitimate purpose, and that is to protect those rights that you get, through nature. That is the dominant view throughout the democratic world after the Second World War. Notice what is not fundamental to this worldview. Well, first of all, God and Scripture are not fundamental to this worldview.
Mm-hmm.
That's privatized, meaning the typical liberal answer to an argument from religion, like let's say that you argue that religion is crucial for morality. The liberal answer is that has to be private. That takes place within the family. It can't be that the government is going to be involved in imposing a certain view of religion or morals. That theory that government has no responsibility to encourage, support religion or morals, that theory by the 1960s drives God and Scripture out of the schools throughout the United States by court order, and it affects the entire West. Every country in the West has adopted, to one degree or another, even here where there's an established church, the intuition that the government should stay out of it.
So there's if I may, the cultural significance of that is that the metaphysical, the religious, was the responsibilities, the yin to the yang of the liberal rights, liberalism's rights.
Yes.
Which I think in the Victorian period, I would argue, or post-Enlightenment, there's sort of a coming together again of the religious with liberalism in a way that they played well with each other. Now, post-war, it seems to me that responsibility that the religion gave us has meant that liberalism has been unmoored, and so it's kind of run wild.
I think I would rather treat your proposal as something, as a historical theory that we would need to.
Okay, fine. So,
no, I mean that because the wedding between liberal values, liberty and equality, wedded to atheism and imperialism, is already full blown in the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay. So maybe that was more of an English bias.
No, for sure. No. You're certainly right that there have been all sorts of attempts to try to fuse liberalism with especially with Protestantism.
Right. Okay.
Right. I mean, Catholics. If you have Patrick Deneen or somebody like that on, then he'll say, "Come on, Yoram. The Protestants are, they're always going to end up being liberals." It's like they like, but let's leave that as a question.
Okay.
I think the answer is that by the time that you get to this trauma, this post-World War II trauma, by the time you get there, you have accepted the French revolutionary thesis that the public sphere, if it's to pursue liberty and equality, can only do it properly if religion is set aside. So in the West, it's set aside not, through executing the priests. It's set aside through privatization. But the effect long term is actually pretty similar. I think that first you get rid of God and Scripture, and then you get rid of nation and family. Right? The state turns family issues into a matter of consent. It's a matter of private concern, whether someone gets married or not, whether they're engaging in what would otherwise be considered marital relations, but with many different people, males and females. I mean, the eradication of thousands of years of state interest, the idea that upholding the Ten Commandments as a central example is the responsibility of the king, is the responsibility of the magistrate. Whoever's governing, it's his job to make sure that certain crucial aspects of Christian religion are upheld as the law of the land. That comes to an end in the 1960s, 1970s in the United States, and then it's like dominoes throughout the rest of the Western world.
Mm-hmm.
So we enter 1989, the year that the Berlin Wall fell. We enter it already with a what I would call a hegemonic liberal consensus. The basic ideas of liberalism are accepted both by the left and the right in all the democratic countries. And after the Soviets are defeated, there's an additional round of cultural revolution. Up until 1989, there's still, lots of people who Reagan himself continued to see the Soviet Union as an atheist menace, to link totalitarianism with atheism, and responsible government with religion. My friends and I, we published a pro-Reagan Thatcher John Paul II magazine called the Princeton Tory when we were in college, and that was exactly the way we saw it. Was that that Reagan still had the pursuit of public virtue by the government, that the government was responsible for encouraging religion. That still existed in Reagan's time. And his alliance with Jerry Falwell, with the moral majority, that was one of the things that most upset, our political rivals, was this insistence that Christianity, Judaism, the Bible, God had a crucial place in public life. But we now know that essentially ended, that tendency to pursue that came to an end when the Berlin Wall fell. And at that point, the last vestiges of, what I call conservatism, which is the insistence on inheriting God and Scripture, independent nation, family in the traditional sense, and then man and woman and various other fundamental categories. All of those, they really come to an end in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall, when suddenly Margaret Thatcher gets pushed out. She's no longer an appropriate prime minister. She and Reagan disappear, and then both in Britain and America and in Europe, the path is opened for I would say the final stage of this post-war liberal purism. And that final stage is, okay, now we no longer have the Soviets, we defeated them. We no longer have the Nazis, we defeated them. There's nothing standing in our way. All we need to do is take it to the end. Let's just take it to the end. We're going to have a new world order. It's going to be liberalism everywhere eternally, the end of history.
Yes.
And that liberalism is a liberalism which says, okay, religion, national identity, history, loyalty to all these subgroups, we're privatizing that. Governments have to be neutral. And all of these thinkers, there's this flourishing of academic thought about, thinking about the political world as though there are no nations, and there are no tribes, and there are no religions, and those things are in the past.
Yes, and in Britain, here, where we're speaking now, as you're talking now, I just think of Tony Blair and New Labour, and this is exactly their agenda was they suddenly have all of these sort of progressive acts and laws that they pass, and then they begin what had already begun after the war was migration. They make it mass migration, and it's not helped when the Tories came in 2010 that they turbocharged it. So even the Tories after New Labour are kind of just the progeny of New Labour, really, in what I view.
They're just liberals, yes.
So this is now happening, the turbocharging of liberalism, or I understand more to be progressivism rather than more classical liberalism. But and then there's the earthquakes of 2016. There's Trump. There's Brexit. There is across Europe you have various political manifestations of the pushback against what I think we're describing as basically globalist progressivism. And do you think that all of these different movements were actually, do you think I'm right to imply that they were actually, despite their different faces in different countries, a reaction to this liberalism unfettered?
Certainly. I mean, almost explicitly so. I mean, the Brexiteers emphasize national independence without emphasizing that it was liberalism, the insistence of the equality of mankind, that all human beings are equal.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, I'm afraid I'm just speaking a little bit too abstractly. Let me give you an example. A liberal political theory, and here it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Locke or Kant, or if you're talking about Rawls or Nozick or Ayn Rand. I mean, all of these are liberal theories. How do you know that they're liberal theories? Because if you look for where is the justification for a national border in these theories, you will never find it. Okay, because the moment that you say all human beings are born free and equal, the moment you accept that statement, you say, okay, I'm in classical liberal, all right, or libertarian. There are all these different versions, but whether you're a John Rawls liberal or a libertarian or a classical liberal, it makes no difference. The question is, when someone comes to your door, to your border, comes in a little boat and says, hello, I'm here. And you say, what are you doing here? We have laws, we have procedures. You just crossed our border. That's a crime. And that visitor says, Winston, what are you talking about? Did we not learn from you English and from John Locke that all men are perfectly free and perfectly equal? And you say, wait, yes, that is part of our tradition and we respect it and it's important and we're good liberals. And he says, no, if you think that I'm perfectly free and that I'm perfectly equal, what right do you have to keep me out of England?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm perfectly free. I'm crossing this border. I'm perfectly equal to you, and you have no claim on this land that's different from my claim. You want to be here and I want to be here. Right? The problem is foundational, that all the different versions of the liberal theories. I just this week read yet another academic book, lovely book by a very fine liberal academic here in Britain. And the book is about global justice. Global justice meaning, how can you justify you sitting here in England and claiming that you don't have a moral obligation to end poverty or oppression every place in the world, and whether it's in Africa or in Asia, you have an obligation. How can you say not? And this is the inevitable consequence of the liberal theory, which does not have a place in its foundations for family, tribe, and nation, for families of nations, from inherited traditions, the existence of human collectives bound together by mutual loyalty, inheriting and propagating certain values, certain texts, certain religions, certain languages. That does not exist in the foundation of the liberal theory. And as a consequence, the liberal theory, wherever you take it seriously, I'm not talking about the first generation where you study some John Locke, but everybody's still religious and everybody's a nationalist and everybody believes in the independence of their country, and no one would imagine allowing millions of foreigners of a different religion. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what's in the book. What's in the book is perfectly free, perfectly equal. And the moment that you insist, that you allow that to be your foundation of your political worldview, you are powerless against someone who says, let me in, I deserve to be there. You are powerless against someone who says, we should take the fruits of our labors and we should send them to Africa, because those people have just as much right to a good life as we do.
Mm-hmm. And no doubt then that's why immigration has been the key issue in all these, well, not all of these countries, but many of these countries in the populism, certainly America and Britain. Do you think that nationalism, I hear you that in the foundation theory of liberalism, there's not room for nationalism, but is there room for a national liberalism? Obviously, you're father of national conservatism, and so you might push back against this. But one thing we often here in Britain is you can't have a welfare state and open borders. It's one or the other. And so you might think of that as an argument for national liberalism. We'll have a closed border, and then within that border, we can have liberalism, we can have a welfare state. And
look, I'm very sympathetic to this argument. I mean, I too have many liberal friends. I wish they would stop. Like I'm doing my best to try to persuade them that the only way to to propagate and transmit any kind of values across generations is through a conservative view that begins by recognizing human nature, which includes the fact that human beings are sticky, that everywhere in history and at all times and places they have tribes. The tribes form nations. Those nations have an inherited religion. They have internal hierarchy. There are leaders who are influential, and then all of these aspects of human nature, which have been ignored by liberal theory for centuries, almost entirely. I do insist on trying to convince my liberal friends that the theory is simplistic to such an extent that it is damaging and destructive everywhere. But having said that,
the theory of national liberalism.
The theory of liberalism.
Oh, okay.
Nobody should be a liberal. All right, here it is. Look, you asked me, no one should be a liberal. No one should make that mistake because the theory is too simple. It's too simple. It is not possible to build a realistic theory of politics if all you've got is individual liberty, individual equality, consent, and the state empowered only to do those things. Okay, I'll give you an example. The preamble to the American Constitution, which many liberals point to as an example of liberalism. The first sentence of the American Constitution begins, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union." we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Forming a more perfect union is not a liberal goal. It is not substantiated, not supported. There are no resources within liberalism for why should you pull together disparate people, treat them as a unity for the purpose of government, self-defense, the general welfare, uh, and propagating what they have through posterity. None of those are liberal values. Okay, so liberalism can only survive if thoroughly mixed with all these conservative things that the liberal theorists don't include. And so when my friends come to me and they say, "Look, Yoram, I'm convinced about the nationalism. I think that we need a Britain that is independent of Europe, independent of America. We'll have representative government. We'll elect our leaders, and someday they'll be better than the ones we've been electing."
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then what we will do inside Britain is that we will finally implement national liberalism. We'll implement liberalism within our country. We will give up on mass immigration. We will give up on absolute free trade, which means sending our factories and our industrial capacity to poorer countries so that we don't have it here anymore. We will give up on endless foreign wars because we don't think it's our responsibility to send our sons and daughters to go and die in Afghanistan. We'll give up on all those things, but we'll be liberal inside Britain. Okay, so I have many friends like that. I love them dearly. We also work together and collaborate on all sorts of joint nationalist projects, and I wouldn't give up those friendships for anything. But if you do not begin by asking, what would we have to do to propagate our ideas and our values to our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren? If you don't begin with that question, then you're not being realistic. And so, whether somebody calls themselves a nationalist or a conservative or some other thing, the first thing is to be realistic. Realistic means the Lockean or Kantian framework. Politics is about individual liberty and individual equality. That framework cuts to ribbons every form of conservatism, every form of political and social theory or inheritance that allows the propagation of things one generation after another. And it's very easy to understand why. If what you do is you teach your children, look, my son, my daughter, I love you. Do whatever you want. Do whatever you want. Anything that makes you happy, right? That's the way that to an extent, that's the way that I was raised. That's the way most people were raised in the 1970s and the 1980s. I brought you into the world. Do whatever you want. Whatever makes you happy, that's going to make me, as your father, that's going to make you happy. Okay, that is, maybe a little bit of a caricature, but not by much. That is if that's what children hear at home, and then they go to school, and that's what they hear at school, and public life is full of that. Do whatever you want, whatever makes you happy. We're now we're 3 generations into this experiment. We know where it ends. The first generation does whatever they want, and they get really excited by having a lot of sex and doing a lot of drugs and listening to awful music, and they do whatever they want, and they transgress, and everybody feels like that's it. We've arrived. Now everyone's free. What happens to the next generation? The children who grow up in the homes of those parents, the grandchildren who grow up in the homes of those parents, where are they? I'll tell you where they are. They're depressed. They're aimless. They don't understand what the purpose of life is. They can't imagine defending their country. They think inherited religion is all nonsense. And then people come along on YouTube and they sell them Nazism or they sell them Marxism, and they can't tell the difference because they don't have any inherited traditions of the kind that would I'm sorry, but Burke called this prejudice. Prejudice today they call it guardrails. The guardrails are the inherited sentiments of a society that can distinguish good from evil. And I'm not saying that the society always gets it right, because different societies will get different things right and some will get it very wrong. But the mechanism, growing up in a home where your parents are saying, your parents, your church, your schools, everybody's saying, no, there is a difference between marriage and no marriage. Marriage is better. There's a difference between having children and having no children. Having children is a commandment. It's a commandment from God. You must do it. It's better. Serving in the military. Should you serve or should you not serve? Of course you should serve, because it's better to serve your country than not. That inheritance, which says the Bible is a better book than Playboy magazine. When you give up on this, and we have, Western societies have given up on it in the name of freedom. When you give up on that, the possibility of being able to transmit anything ends. Liberalism is a rebellion against the past. Liberalism is a rebellion against the mechanisms of inheritance and transmission. And if it weren't, then it wouldn't begin with all human beings being born perfectly free and perfectly equal, because we know that's not even a fact. I've had children. I know they're not born perfectly free and perfectly equal. They're born into a hierarchical family where people are in charge of them for decades. They're born into a place where loyalty to your parents, loving your parents, respecting your parents is crucial. And it's more important than loving the neighbor and respecting the neighbor. So they're never free and they're never equal. It's just not true. So we're teaching them something it's like a noble lie, except that when you teach this lie generation after generation, you destroy absolutely everything that is of worth to you. So they should stop.
Yeah. And it's also the case that if you want meaning and if you want meaningful life, you actually need those responsibilities that you describe. And I speak from personal experience. The further I've drifted away from responsibility, the less meaningful my life was. And when I came back to responsibility, it was far more fulfilling. You've painted a very bleak picture.
I apologize.
But your influence, as I mentioned earlier, is that the Vice President J.D. Vance has been reading you and listening to you. Can the West be turned around?
Look, the West for me is a civilization that's built on the Bible. Okay, I don't mean to downplay.
So it's not a political, because I asked the question. I guess I framed it in a political sense.
No. I think the Bible is a political document. I mean, I don't. In addition to being a theological and a moral document, it's also a political document. Huh. So I do not mean to brush aside the contributions of Greece and Rome or any other thing that people would want to propose. But
how is it a political document? Do you mean? Oh, I guess the Old Testament. You argue in this book.
Yes, for sure.
The New Testament you consider a political document?
I'm not sure I want to go into this, because my Christian friends are having just an endless, very difficult debate about whether the New Testament is fundamentally like the Old Testament about creating a certain kind of positive and virtuous political order on earth, or whether the New Testament actually is more hands-off about this earth. I don't want to take sides in this. I think, I'm not an expert in New Testament. I can tell you for sure that the Old Testament is built, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament is built around a story, and that story begins with the creation of the earth and then goes to the creation of nations and the creation of a particular nation. Mm-hmm. Okay, and the first half of the Old Testament, from Genesis to Kings, is the story of the attempt to bring into being a nation that will be united and live under God, that will walk in God's ways. And there's, obviously a hope that all nations will reach that. But the story itself is about a particular nation.
Yes.
There are neighboring nations. Every place where the Old Testament has gone and has been taken seriously, certainly for sure in England and in
Yes.
Scotland, absolutely, and many other places. The view that a correct understanding of the relationship between man and God begins with a family that takes part in the life of a nation, and that family tries to live under God, and that nation tries to live under God. And it's the story of what are the hardships. I mean, the story probably understates it, since it's given to us as narrative, but the narrative is freighted with answers to all sorts of questions. The question is, if you want your family, your tribe, your nation to propagate through time, receiving the blessings of God, not just in some other life, but in this life, you want the blessings of God, what must you do? And that image, that vision of, we could be here, we could be God's Israel. Here in England, let's try to do that. Let's try to be Israel.
That's actually what King Alfred did. The founding.
Yes,
hugely inspired by the nation of Israel.
For sure. I mean, he literally took
the model of the Israelites.
He literally took laws from the Old Testament and promulgated them as English law. And it's a little bit troubling that this Hebraic founding of the United English people, that it's overlooked, and people are always talking about the common law as if it has nothing to do with Scripture. It isn't true. The common law comes into existence with Scripture.
Absolutely.
But the Old Testament, unlike the New Testament, is an unequivocally political text.
Yes.
Okay, it's about our relationship with God, but it's about the relationship of a people with God. What do we need to do in order to be blessed? What do we need to do to live according to God's ways?
Yes.
And so you asked me about, am I optimistic or pessimistic?
Yes, this is.
Yes. Yeah. So let me say that I am neither. My view is biblical, and I'll tell you exactly what I mean by it. From the perspectives of Hebrew Scripture, the world does not simply work. The human world does not simply function according to automatic laws. Human beings are great at looking at what's happening and saying, oh my God, I can see the trajectory. You'll notice that many people, when you and I look at one trajectory and we see the trajectory clear as day. And then we talk to our friends and they see it upside down. They say, no, it's the opposite trajectory. Steven Pinker thinks things have never been better. Enlightenment now. Enlightenment has fixed it all. Things are just getting better and better. I see I like Steven. I like him a lot, but I see things absolutely the reverse from him. So here's the thing. Human beings are not actually good at knowing what's going to happen. And we're actually terrible about it. Like we didn't see the fall of the Soviet Union, and we didn't see the 2008 stock market crash, and we didn't see the return of nationalism, and we didn't see the rise of the woke. We're terrible. We just terrible at seeing what's going to happen. I believe that that you and I and all of our friends and people who are anywhere near thinking the kinds of things that you and I think about, we need to return to God. We need to return to Scripture. We need to be attending church, synagogue. We need to be marrying early, raising our children, taking them to pray with us, to the house of worship, to try to reconnect to the ancient inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
In the Bible, we know that sometimes you try and try. Prophet Jeremiah tried and succeeded with some things. Josiah the king, and in the end, it wasn't enough, and the kingdom comes to an end. They tried, God decided the sins are too heavy, and it came to an end. We also have the book of Jonah, where the Assyrian Empire, when you read Jonah and you're talking about Assyria, you're talking about, the prophets of Israel thought the Assyrians were the most evil that there could be on earth. This is, a ferocious imperial nation that every single, with a mission to conquer the four corners of the earth, every single year for 300 years, they set out to war and destroy everything in their path. And in Jonah, the prophet comes to Nineveh, to the capital of Assyria, and says, God's about to destroy you. You have to repent. And shockingly, incredibly, the king goes into mourning, and he puts on sackcloth, and he tells all of his people to put on sackcloth. They get the animals to put on the entire civilization, king, aristocrats, people, farmers, and their animals. They're all praying, please save us, we'll repent. And God forgives them. And Jonah says, what are you doing? They're the most evil people in the world. And God says, listen, Jonah, give me a break. There's like millions of people here, and I'm not simply going to wipe them out because you think that they've gotten evil enough and they need to be destroyed. Okay, so we have Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham argues with him, but he can't convince them. They're wiped out. And we have Nineveh, which is saved by repentance. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because I don't believe we know whether we can turn it around. There is no way for us with our limited powers to know whether we're going to save this country or this civilization. We can't know. We can know what the right thing to do is. We can put everything we have, heart and soul, into turning this country around. And God willing, God will hopefully hear our cries and he'll help us.
Hopefully indeed. So we're going to go behind the Substack to discuss the woke right and the post-war consensus, or rather those who have misdiagnosed the post-war consensus, be they the so-called woke right or the neo-Nazis that we're seeing emerge on the online right, particularly in America. Before we do that, Yoram, is there anything you want to bring people's attention to?
Okay, you can find me on Twitter at Yhazony, Yhazony. You can also go to my website, yoramhazony.org. And please go to nationalconservatism.org or to natcon.org and come to the National Conservatism Conference September 2nd through 4th. It's going to be marvelous.
That's in Washington, D.C.?
In Washington, D.C.
Wonderful.
The Virtue of Nationalism, there's a new edition. The new edition is prettier than this one. It's white. It's very nice, and it's available in paperback. It's available in audiobook, and you can get it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and every place else that books are sold.
Yoram Hazony, thank you so much. People who rightly go back to the sort of war period, they've come to very different conclusions.
The term woke right is being used in order to discredit. Look, you can decide if you want to broadcast this or not.
I think it's useful to hear your side of the argument.
Certain podcasters on the right with the claim that Hitler was a Christian and that Christianity itself should respect Nazism.
Wow.
It's surprising.
I hadn't heard that. Thank you for watching The Winston Marshall Show with Yoram Hazony. If you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, now you'll enjoy that extended conversation between me and Yoram, where we go a little bit deeper on some of those misinterpretations of the post-war consensus, and we explore the so-called woke right. If you also stay on winstonmarshall.co.uk, you'll be able to ask future guests your questions. So thank you for your continued support. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, be well.